We're going to talk about really what's the validation, what's the value of validation, which at the highest level, certainly we can get to certification, but also we validate learning in our everyday learning courses. So we're going to start there. We'll get much more into credentialing in the app labs this afternoon and tomorrow. But starting out generally, first I want to say, you're sitting there thinking, really, Mickie, are you going to sit here and lecture us on Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation? Is that what we're going to do for the next 20 minutes? No, we're not. But it's a starting point, because these are kind of the areas that you could validate if you're going to validate your learning programs. I'm going to focus mostly on learning, since we're learning professionals. We're going to start there primarily because I think where most of us are is trying to validate the reaction. We need to at least get to validating the learning, and I think we have to do that before we get to the next levels. And so I'm going to focus there just because it really is the foundation. So here are kind of the levels. I wanted to ask you, where do you think associations spend most of their time validating which of these? Reaction, learning, behavior, or results? Reaction, absolutely. Let me just ask, how many of you, through your learning programs, do you evaluate learner reaction? How many of you do that? How many of you evaluate or validate the learning? Actually, a good number of hands there. I'm pleased with that. How about evaluating, does it translate into behavior? And how many does it actually translate into results for the organization? Okay. Why do you think that we focus on mostly obviously there were a lot more hands up for reaction. Why do you think we focus there?
Because it's easy. Okay,
yeah, and I'm going to challenge that in a minute. The answer is it's easy. Relatively so, though, yes. It is easier than learning behavior and results, certainly. But I guess the first question here is, what really does that level 1 validate? So in your own course evaluations, what are you typically validating? Did I hear satisfaction?
Satisfaction.
Yeah, that's a big one, satisfaction.
Expectations met.
Expectations?
The learning environment.
The learning environment, that's a good one. Effectiveness, yes. Yes, so now we're getting more substantive. How many of you, and I know there's at least one in the room because he brought his book with him, how many of you have actually read this book? So, okay, good, 5 or so. Well, Will Thalheimer has a problem with this level of the current practice in evaluating reaction. And here's something he said, and I'm going to give you a little more information too. He said about these smiley sheets that we use at conferences, that he not so lovingly, I think, calls them. They're a self-inflicted form of mind control, warping our thoughts from learning's essential realities. So yeah, tell us what you really think, Will. And he actually goes on, got to put on my readers or else I won't be able to see it. He goes on to say that smile sheets as now designed do not just tell us nothing, they tell us worse than nothing. They focus our worries toward the wrong things. They make us think our learning interventions are more effective than they are. And more than any other practice in our field, they have done the most damage. So I just wanted to challenge that thinking a little bit, maybe a lot of bit, about that they're easy, and that's why we do them. I think he would disagree. And some of the reasons why these level 1 reaction, these smile sheets, what are the challenges with them? There's actually some really, I was going to say good research, but there's strong research. I hope it's not really good research from the perspective of showing that there actually is very little and sometimes no correlation with our findings on our level 1 smile sheets to actual learning. So believe it or not, there's been actual studies done on that. So, what did the evaluation forms show, and there were objective measures of learning, and did they learn? Very little, and sometimes no correlation. And the big kicker, there's sometimes a negative correlation. So think about why that would happen, though. So if you have a speaker, they're funny, they're likable, you're enjoying the session, and maybe more importantly, they're not challenging your mental models. Maybe they're even verifying what you're doing, it's good. They're probably going to be evaluated pretty high on the measures we're asking them for on the evaluation sheets. but did they learn anything? And so in contrast, if you had a teacher that was actually making you work, right? These, everybody, oh, you're going to make me do a role play, So if they make you work and they challenge what you're currently doing, maybe saying what you're doing is not effective, are those going to be evaluated as positively? So again, there's actual research here that there is sometimes a negative correlation to the evaluation form results to actual learning. I think that's something we really, as learning professionals, need to take seriously, because I have been guilty of that in my learning the evaluation forms. You just kind of, you ask the standard questions, and how many times really do our evaluations ask things about just, are you happy with the food, the temperature? Right? We're focusing on the wrong things. And here's the big one too. How often is that data that we generate from those evaluation forms actionable? We get a lot of data, but what do we do with them? I'm sure we've got a lot of the cream of the crop here in the room. Many of you sound like are doing things because you're evaluating learning, you're saying, and evaluating transferring of learning. But in general, for our association field, I think we really have to think about this. I guess on the positive note, there are lots of opportunities here because, right, there's much room for improvement here. And I'm not going to spend much more time on this because I want to focus on evaluating learning, but two things really to think about here. The purposes of your overall goals for your evaluation forms. I'm embarrassed to say, back when I was in association learning, actually in that job, I don't know that I really thought about this, that the purpose of those are really to gauge the effectiveness of learning design. It sounds like a kind of a duh, but really I think that the evaluation forms become so much of a habit, we just do them, and we just ask the same questions, we collect the same data. But think about that, the effectiveness of the learning design, because we want actionable data. So how can we change that design next time to, again, make the learning more effective? So I think we really need to change how we're looking at this. So really, like I said, the main thing I want to get to learning, the main thing I wanted to just at least get you thinking about is kind of going back maybe and thinking about how you're doing evaluation. So, and I encourage you, not that I'm getting no profits off of this book, I assure you, but it's a good one. I would recommend, if you spent 2 hours with this book, I think you could transform actually your evaluation forms. Do we have a testimonial in the front? You like the book too, right? Yeah. So I would encourage you, and there are actual sample questions in here too that you can actually put right into use. So who's on Amazon right now buying this? Whoever rose their hand was going to get this book. So I would say, somebody raise your hand and say you're on Amazon right now. Okay, here, you're the closest to me. One of you guys come up. And here's the main reason I can get rid of this book. When you're as busy as me and getting as old as I am, I accidentally bought a second copy. I bought one in August, right when it came out, because it's a 2016 book. Bought it, I think before it was even available on Amazon. It was coming, so I bought it, got it out of the box, stuck it on the shelf. About a month ago, I was like, I can't believe I haven't got that book. And I ordered another one. So there you go. That one's yours. Okay, so let's get to, so that was evaluating, validating reaction. A lot of work we have to do there. So this is probably an obvious question. Why do we want to validate learning? Oh, come on, it's really obvious. To see if they learned anything would probably be why we want to, come on, get some coffee. But why do we want to do that? And I would say here, one of the themes of the conference, impact, reach, revenue. And I'm going to give you an example of this. The Commission on Dietetic Registration is the credentialing agency for the American Dietetic Association, actually now the Academy for Nutrition and Dietetics, and they had a program that does validate learning. It's a certificate program. We're going to talk about certificate programs a lot in the app labs today and tomorrow if you want to learn more about those. So this particular program, I'd say, did all three of those very well. It's a certificate program in weight management for dietitians to teach weight management, by the way, not for them to manage their own weight. And this certificate program was created, thinking like 15 years ago now, before we even really started talking about certificate programs and associations. But there are standards now, they weren't existing then. It was really before certificates were cool. And And so basically, it's the model where a certificate program, when I'm talking about that, where you're teaching to very specific learning objectives, but then you assess, have they mastered those learning objectives before they actually get the certificate? So some people fail, some pass. You have to pass to get the certificate. This particular program, in terms of impact, was written into job descriptions, either as recommendations, requirements. It was so valuable that happened. So then what happened because of that impact? The reach. People started recommending it. Again, it started getting written into jobs. So of course, more people came. The commission actually sold out of like the programs they offered for years, actually. I mean, they're in like 15th year, and I think they're still selling out of the program. And of course, then once you have impact and reach, lots of potential for revenue. Their particular model doesn't generate a lot of revenue because it wasn't intended to. But it certainly could have, had they wanted to. They priced it really to be more cost recoverable. They thought it was so important. An interesting thing on revenue though with this program, I'm going to guess that you've heard this in some of your associations at least, that members complaining about the member fee, that it's so high every time they have to pay that. Well, this particular association, community, was actually at the same time this program launched for the first time, the House of Delegates of this organization was really fighting, we can't increase member fees because our members can't afford it. This was an ongoing debate. This program cost twice the cost of membership, and it sold out every time. So again, the value. If you provide the impact, you will get the reach and the revenue. One other thing I wanted to talk about here, though, too, is kind of a bonus of when you validate the learning in your courses. A bonus is it forces quality learning design if you didn't have it before. On that CDR model that I was telling, I lived that firsthand. I helped them create the program. One thing that was fascinating to me was that, so we had to have an assessment at the end, right? We had to determine who was actually going to get the certificate or not. So then you have to backtrack to that. You have to have accessible learning outcomes. And then you have to make sure that you teach them. And then you have to make sure that's aligned with what you're assessing. How many have actually tried to do that? Anybody? So a handful. It's easier said than done. What I realized in that case was how much free rein we typically give faculty. This is a face-to-face course. And just the idea of work, so I was working with all the experts, physicians and dietitians, across the country that are the experts in these fields, surgical, et cetera, and getting them to actually identify what the learning objectives of their sessions were going to be was not easy. And then to actually have them create presentations that actually were in alignment with those, this was like rocket science, like who does this? And then to actually make sure they stuck with that, to make sure they covered what we had on the assessment. It was such an activity that I never imagined. I actually sat in the back of the room for the first several and actually with the assessment, checking off if it was covered. And sometimes they weren't. It was a learning process. And so don't underestimate how challenging and rewarding it is to create something with very specific learning objectives, again, and teaching to them and then assessing them. Because think about how often we plan our events, our learning events. You come up with a topic, you ask the speaker to speak to it, and they might give you some learning objectives, but then really, they kind of have free rein. So just know that if you're going to assess at the end, you've got to have tight control over what they teach. Because I can guarantee firsthand, I saw it, that trying to get them to really focus was hard. Question?
We're shifting to a competency-based model in our education programs, and that, as you say, is extremely tough, trying to link content to what's in the course and then what the instructors teach, what we assess, those types of things. I guess I'm just saying that to say if anybody's working on something like that, come and grab me at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Well, and just real quick, another model, then we'll move on, is I worked with another group that had a certificate program, really high stakes one. And we're going to talk about the stakes of a program here in a minute. Boating, marine law officers, and talking about boating under the influence. And so these individuals at the end of the course, if they got the certificate, if they passed the assessments, they had to actually administer the voting under the influence test to determine if someone was under the influence or not. And their assessment, by the way, was an actual wet lab. There were actually people there at different levels of inebriation, and they had to administer the test on them. I mean, this is high stakes. I saw some volunteers. Okay, awesome, great. For science sake. Well, this particular program was so interesting because they wanted, you can get your certificate programs, just like certification, you can get them accredited by a third party. They wanted to do that. And so in assessing their program, you know, it was interesting. They had, this program was in existence when I came in. They had a 20-question test. Remember, they have the wet lab too. That's separate, the performance-based. But their written test was 20 questions. They had like 130 learning objectives. Think about that alignment just for a minute. Is that possible? Right? So what, you know, back to what, this alignment, it forces you. So what ended up happening actually is they didn't really lose many of those learning objectives. They decided, we're teaching a lot of things, and we're not going to stop that. They're helpful, but many of them are nice to know. Here are our accessible learning outcomes. And then that's what the assessment was focused on. Where before, before we did that activity, that assessment, they were just across the board. A lot of the things they were asking about in the assessment weren't the important things. So again, some really, really bonus points. Okay, so the bad news though. Assessing learning can be time and resource intensive. I mean, anybody that does it, will you argue with that statement? Right? And it requires a unique knowledge and skill set. Not everyone can write, even if we're talking multiple choice questions, much less the performance-based assessments. Multiple choice questions are not, bad ones are easy to write. Good ones are not easy to write. It really is a skill set. So that something a lot of associations don't have, and don't think your subject matter experts are it. Because they're not. That's not their skill set, right? Theirs is the subject matter expertise. So because of that, sometimes it does require consultants, or even if your subject matter involvement there too, right? That's money. And who am I kidding? There's some resistance to assessment, right? Who wants to really be assessed? So because of that, we actually need to decide then which programs we should validate the learning, right? We know we can't do that for all of our programs, probably don't need to. So how do we decide? Very simple framework here that I'll propose. We'll probably even improve this by the time we're done with this meeting. But just to get us started, here are some things I would say to think about. Think about the learning objectives, and we're going to go through each one of these. But all of them are on kind of a scale, from kind of low to high. No, we probably don't need to validate learning, up to, yeah, maybe we do. Again, and it's not some hard, fast rules here, but just things to think about. So let's go through each of those things. The learning objectives. You've seen this probably too, Bloom's taxonomy. I would advocate that the lower you are on this scale, the lower the learning that you're giving is on this scale, the less likely you need to validate the learning. And I think there should be a word below remembering, which would really just be awareness. I think a lot of our webinars and things like that, we're just trying to get them aware of some things. And maybe they know the resources for later. We're not even asking them maybe to even remember it, right? So I think I'd add a level there. But the further you go up, if you're asking someone to actually be able to apply that knowledge, maybe we should be validating the learning then. So that's one thing on the scale. The stakes. So if you have a really, by the way, for each of these scales, there's things in between. I'm giving you this end and this end. But say that low or no stakes. If this is a course that's really someone's just taking voluntarily for some learning, professional development, maybe you don't need to validate the learning. But on the other end of this scale, is it required for employment? Like I said, that certificate program in weight management became required. Now you better validate learning. There's a lot of certificate programs out there which I wouldn't even, call a certificate that does no validation of learning. If it's required for employment, you probably should do that. What about if it's required to earn or maintain a credential? Probably. Or if it results in a credential, certainly. These are ones you want to think about. What about the content of the program itself? If you're talking about trends, tools, tips, right? Some nice to know information. I always think webinars for some reason, but that may not be the case. How about conference presentations, right? There's a lot of kind of nice to know there. Hey, it's been 20 minutes, so I did set my timer. So versus the critical to practice. right? So if you're talking about new regulations, medical techniques, ethics, right, that's where you might want to evaluate the learning. Resources available. It's a big one, right? Do you have the time to develop the assessment instruments? Do you have the time within your learning programs to deliver them? Do you have access to the learners before the course, if you're thinking about pre-test, during the course, and after the course? That's a big question. Sometimes we don't. We talked about this already a little bit. Qualified personnel. Do you have them to be able to, again, develop the assessments and deliver them? And, of course, budget. So I'm going to go through a couple just really quick examples here, and then we'll wrap up. So think about this scale. If you have a free webinar introducing a new learning management systems that came on the market, where's that kind of fall? Which side? Does it go to the no side or to the yes side? If you just had to go quick, right? Yeah, I mean, I would say, again, in an ideal world, maybe we would evaluate the learning for all of our programs. But this one, right, and this is where I would say, this is more awareness. It's not even to the remember level. So even on that alone, and low stakes, it's more informational to begin with. What about a symposia on new regulations that must be implemented by all companies within your membership within a year? Yeah, right, immediately. You don't have to go through all of them. What about the Red Cross CPR course? Right, that's a kind of a gimme too, just on the high stakes, critical to practice, right? But this gets to, would you really feel comfortable issuing a certificate to someone on CPR if you didn't validate their learning? So I think that's what we have to think about. Again, I see a lot of programs out there that are called credentials, called certification, called certificate, whatever they're called, and there really isn't a validation of learning. And so I think we have to think about that too. Should we issue those things if we really aren't validating learning? So a caution though, I have to say, if I'm going to talk about assessments, including bad learning assessments within your learning events can actually do more harm than having none. So just consider, and here's a couple reasons why. If you don't give feedback, so you give us an assessment, say within an online course, realistic scenario here, in an online course, you have some pop-up assessments, some learning assessments, and somebody gets several of them wrong, and they were really critical points. If you didn't give them any feedback that those were wrong, that is now what's left in their mind of what the right answer is. So, right, that's how you can actually harm learning by a bad assessment. And here's another big one, especially if you have your subject matter experts writing the assessments, that the assessments reinforce the unimportant concepts. Because really, those, in what year was Kirkpatrick born? That's really the easiest question to write. Is that really relevant to learning? But those are kind of questions often get written into these assessments. And so that's what your learners walk away from is, boy, was that important? They're really important concepts that aren't touched. So be careful about that. So in closing, just that we as learning professionals, just want to emphasize that revenue, reach, and impact is what it's all about. And I'm going to advocate, as a credentialing professional, right, that we have to evaluate our learning in those cases where it's appropriate. And I invite you, if you would like to learn more about this, in the app lab, I'm going to actually talk about some specific examples of how you can take your learning programs and turn them into certificate programs with an assessment, micro credentials, and stacking them and to achieve something at the end. So just to give you a little taste of what we're going to talk about there. So more on the credentialing side.